Cole Thornwood had spent 15 years convincing himself he had forgotten the girl he pulled from the river. Then she appeared in his corral, arms crossed, and spoke 6 words that made his blood run cold. "Prove you're still worthy of me." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The August sun beat down on the dusty corral of the Thornwood Ranch, casting long shadows across weathered fence posts that had stood witness to 3 generations of cattle drives and broken promises. Cole Thornwood wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his calloused fingers rough against skin that had been tanned and creased by 40 years of Wyoming wind. The horses shifted nervously in the afternoon heat, their hooves stirring up small clouds of dust that caught the light like golden smoke. He had just finished checking the fence line on the south pasture when he heard the sound of approaching hooves, steady and purposeful. Cole Thornwood had spent 15 years convincing himself he had forgotten the girl he pulled from the river. Then she appeared in his corral, arms crossed, and spoke 6 words that made his blood run cold. "Prove you're still worthy of me." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The August sun beat down on the dusty corral of the Thornwood Ranch, casting long shadows across weathered fence posts that had stood witness to 3 generations of cattle drives and broken promises. Cole Thornwood wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his calloused fingers rough against skin that had been tanned and creased by 40 years of Wyoming wind. The horses shifted nervously in the afternoon heat, their hooves stirring up small clouds of dust that caught the light like golden smoke. He had just finished checking the fence line on the south pasture when he heard the sound of approaching hooves, steady and purposeful. Cole Thornwood had spent 15 years convincing himself he had forgotten the girl he pulled from the river. Then she appeared in his corral, arms crossed, and spoke 6 words that made his blood run cold. "Prove you're still worthy of me." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The August sun beat down on the dusty corral of the Thornwood Ranch, casting long shadows across weathered fence posts that had stood witness to 3 generations of cattle drives and broken promises. Cole Thornwood wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his calloused fingers rough against skin that had been tanned and creased by 40 years of Wyoming wind. The horses shifted nervously in the afternoon heat, their hooves stirring up small clouds of dust that caught the light like golden smoke. He had just finished checking the fence line on the south pasture when he heard the sound of approaching hooves, steady and purposeful. Cole Thornwood had spent 15 years convincing himself he had forgotten the girl he pulled from the river. Then she appeared in his corral, arms crossed, and spoke 6 words that made his blood run cold. "Prove you're still worthy of me." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The August sun beat down on the dusty corral of the Thornwood Ranch, casting long shadows across weathered fence posts that had stood witness to 3 generations of cattle drives and broken promises. Cole Thornwood wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his calloused fingers rough against skin that had been tanned and creased by 40 years of Wyoming wind. The horses shifted nervously in the afternoon heat, their hooves stirring up small clouds of dust that caught the light like golden smoke. He had just finished checking the fence line on the south pasture when he heard the sound of approaching hooves, steady and purposeful. Cole Thornwood had spent 15 years convincing himself he had forgotten the girl he pulled from the river. Then she appeared in his corral, arms crossed, and spoke 6 words that made his blood run cold. "Prove you're still worthy of me." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The August sun beat down on the dusty corral of the Thornwood Ranch, casting long shadows across weathered fence posts that had stood witness to 3 generations of cattle drives and broken promises. Cole Thornwood wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his calloused fingers rough against skin that had been tanned and creased by 40 years of Wyoming wind. The horses shifted nervously in the afternoon heat, their hooves stirring up small clouds of dust that caught the light like golden smoke. He had just finished checking the fence line on the south pasture when he heard the sound of approaching hooves, steady and purposeful, the sage and sweetgrass that clung to her hair. The sage and sweetgrass that clung to her hair. "You promised me nothing with your words," she agreed, "but your actions made promises that words could never contain. You risked everything to save a stranger from the river. You sat beside my bed while I burned with fever, speaking to me of your land and your dreams and the life you hope to build. You looked at me as if I were precious, as if my survival mattered more than your own comfort." She tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "Those are the promises I have come to collect, Cole. The promise that the man who would risk his life for a stranger would be worthy of being more than a stranger to me." Cole felt something tighten in his chest. "You were a girl then, a child, and now I am a woman." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only challenge. "A woman who has spent 15 years becoming someone worthy of the sacrifice you made. I have learned to read the land and the sky. I have studied the ways of my people and the ways of yours. Negotiated treaties with men who would rather see us erased from the earth." She stepped closer, and he could see the fire burning in her eyes. "I have made myself into someone who could stand beside you as an equal, Cole Thornwood. The question is whether you have done the same. Negotiated treaties with men who would rather see us erased from the earth." She stepped closer, and he could see the fire burning in her eyes. "I have made myself into someone who could stand beside you as an equal, Cole Thornwood. The question is whether you have done the same." Before he could respond, she raised one hand to silence him. "Tomorrow, I will give you 3 challenges. If you complete them, you will prove that the courage and compassion you showed 15 years ago were not accidents of youth, but the true measure of your character. If you fail," she paused, and something flickered in her expression that might have been vulnerability quickly masked, "then I will know that I have spent 15 years chasing a ghost, and I will return to my people and never trouble you again." Cole stared at her, his mind struggling to process everything she was saying. 3 challenges? What kind of challenges? That is for tomorrow. Tonight, she turned and walked back to her horse with the same fluid grace that characterized all her movements. "I will camp by the river, the same river that brought us together and tore my family apart. I will pray to my ancestors for guidance, and I will prepare myself for what is to come." She mounted her horse and looked down at him with an expression, "Thanks that you have not changed too much. Thanks that you have not changed too much." Then she was gone, riding toward the river with the setting sun at her back, leaving Cole standing alone in the corral with his hat in his hands and his heart pounding against his ribs like a wild thing trying to escape its cage. The horses whickered nervously, sensing the turmoil in their master, and somewhere in the distance a coyote began its evening song. Cole looked down at the hat he had been crushing in his grip and slowly, deliberately placed it back on his head. Whatever challenges Ayesha Clearwater had planned for him, he would face them. He had spent 15 years waiting for her return without even admitting to himself that he was waiting. He would not fail her now. The question was whether the man he had become was truly worthy of the woman she had grown into, or whether the hero she remembered had been nothing more than a young fool who got lucky once and had been trading on that luck ever since. Tomorrow would tell. Tonight, he had preparations of his own to make. The porch of the ranch house his grandfather had built, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, and he thought about the girl who had become a woman and returned to claim something he was not even sure he knew how to give. The night air carried the scent of sage and dust. The porch of the ranch house his grandfather had built, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, and he thought about the girl who had become a woman and returned to claim something he was not even sure he knew how to give. The night air carried the scent of sage and dust, and somewhere down by the river, he imagined he could see the faint glow of a campfire where Ayesha kept her vigil. His foreman, a grizzled veteran named Hank Dawson, who had worked the Thornwood spread since before Cole was born, found him there at first light. The old man took one look at Cole's face and lowered himself onto the porch step with a grunt that spoke of decades of hard riding and harder living. Saw her ride in yesterday, Hank said without preamble. The Clearwater girl. Though I suppose she ain't a girl no more, is she? No, Cole agreed, his voice hoarse from the long night of silence and contemplation. She is not. Hank pulled a tobacco pouch from his vest pocket and began rolling a cigarette, drawing the smoke deep into his lungs. They say she turned down a dozen marriage proposals from chiefs and warriors, always saying she had a promise to keep first. Cole turned to look at the old man, something sharp and painful twisting in his chest. She told you this? Did not have to. Hank exhaled a stream of smoke that caught the first rays of morning sun. Word travels, boss, especially word about a woman like that. People been wondering for years who she was waiting for. He squinted at Cole through the smoke. Guess now we know. She wants me to prove myself, Cole said, the words feeling strange and inadequate on his tongue. 3 challenges. She did not say what they would be. Hank nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense to him. Her people set great store by such things. Tests of character, tests of worth. A man who wants to stand beside a chief's daughter has to show he deserves the honor. He took another drag on his cigarette. Question is, do you want to stand beside her? Cole thought about the question longer than years of emptiness, the women he had courted without enthusiasm, the way his heart had never quite engaged with the life everyone expected him to build. He thought about the moment he had pulled Ayasha from the river, how light she had seemed in his arms, how fiercely she had clung to him as he fought their years of emptiness, the women he had courted without enthusiasm, the way his heart had never quite engaged with the life everyone expected him to build. He thought about the moment he had pulled Ayasha from the river, how light she had seemed in his arms, how fiercely she had clung to him as he fought their current. He thought about the weeks he had spent at her bedside, watching her fight back from the edge of death with a determination that had changed something fundamental in his understanding of strength. Yes, he said finally, I want that more than I have ever wanted anything. Hank finished his cigarette and crushed it under his boot heel. Then you best get down to that river, boss. Sun's up, and I reckon your lady ain't the patient type. Cole found her waiting at the riverbank, standing at the exact spot where he had pulled her from the water 15 years ago. The morning light turned her black hair to burnished copper, and the turquoise at her throat and wrists seemed to glow with it. Asked. My father was a great chief, my mother a healer of considerable skill. They were going to meet with government officials to try to secure our people's future through words instead of weapons. She turned then, and he saw that her eyes were dry but filled with an old grief that had never fully healed. Instead, they died in water that was not even deep enough to cover a tall man's head, killed by a current they could not fight and a storm they could not outrun. I am sorry, Cole said, because there was nothing else to say. I wish I could have saved them too. You saved me. That is enough. She studied his face with an intensity that made him want to look away, though he forced himself to hold her gaze. You saved me, and in doing so, you gave my people a future. Everything I have accomplished since that night, the schools, the treaties, the battles we have won, exists because you rode into that river without thinking about the cost. She stepped closer to him. Is why I have to know if that man still exists, Cole. If the courage that saved my life is still burning inside you, or if it was just a young man's recklessness that has long since burned away. Tell me your challenges, he said. Whatever they are, I will face them. She smiled then, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. Is why I have to know if that man still exists, Cole. If the courage that saved my life is still burning inside you, or if it was just a young man's recklessness that has long since burned away. Tell me your challenges, he said. Whatever they are, I will face them. She smiled then, the first genuine smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face into something so beautiful that it made his chest ache. The first challenge, she said, is the challenge of memory. You must show me that you remember who I was, not just as the girl you saved, but as the person you came to know during those weeks when I lay in your mother's house, fighting to live. She crossed her arms over her chest, the same posture of challenge she had held in the corral. Tell me 3 things about myself that I shared with you during that time. 3 things that mattered to me then and still matter to me now." Cole felt a moment of panic. 15 years was a long time, and he had been so focused on her survival that he wondered at room in his mother's house, where Ayesha had fought her way back to life. He remembered the smell of the herbal poultices his mother had prepared, the way the curtains had moved in the spring breeze, the sound of Ayesha's voice growing stronger day by day as the fever released its grip on her body. And he remembered the things she had told him during those long nights when sleep would not come, and talking seemed to ease the pain of everything she had lost. "You told me about your grandmother," he said slowly, opening his eyes to find Ayesha watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "She was a medicine woman, the most powerful healer your tribe had seen in 3 generations. But before she passed, she taught you the songs that called the healing spirits. You said that singing those songs was the only time you felt truly connected to something larger than yourself." He paused, searching her face for some sign that he was on the right path. "You sang one of them for me once, when my mother had stepped out of the room. Your voice was barely a whisper, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard." Something shifted in Ayesha's expression, a softening around her eyes that told him he had touched something true. "Go on," she said quietly. Cole took a breath, reaching deeper into his memories. "You told me about the horse your father gave you on your 14th birthday, a spotted mare named Wind Dancer, who had been your constant companion since the day she was foaled." He watched Ayesha's hands tighten almost imperceptibly where they rested against her crossed arms. "You said she was the smartest horse you had ever known, that she could read your moods better than any person. She was in the wagon when it went into the river. You made me promise not to tell anyone that losing her hurt almost as much as losing your parents, because you were afraid people would think you were foolish for grieving a horse so deeply." The paint mare standing behind Ayesha nickered softly, and Cole saw the way Ayesha's jaw tightened with controlled emotion. The horse she rode now had the same coloring as the one she had described all those years ago, and he understood suddenly that some losses could never truly be replaced, only honored through remembrance. "One more," Ayesha said, and her voice was not quite steady. "One more thing, Cole Thornwood, and this challenge will be complete." He knew immediately what the 3rd memory had to be. It was the one that had stayed with him most clearly through all the intervening years, the one he had carried like a secret treasure in his heart, even when he had convinced himself that he had forgotten her face and her voice and everything else about those weeks they had shared. "You told me about the vision you had during the worst of your fever," he said softly. "You were standing at the edge of a great canyon, and on the other side stood all your ancestors, stretching back through countless generations. They were calling to you, asking you to cross over and join them. You said it would have been so easy to step off the edge and let yourself fall into their arms." He stepped closer to her, close enough that he could see the way her breath caught in her throat. "But then you heard another voice, a voice from this side of the canyon, a man's voice, you said, though you could not see his face. He was asking you to stay, telling you that there was still work to be done in the world of the living, still a purpose waiting for you that you had not yet discovered. You told me that voice was the reason you chose to live." Ayesha was silent for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. Then she nodded slowly, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight of emotion that 15 years had not diminished. "The voice I heard was yours, Cole. I did not realize it then, but I know it now." She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, directly over his heart. "You called me back from the edge of death, not just with your strength in the river, but with your words during those long nights, your stories about the ranch and your dreams for the future, your patience when I could not speak, your presence when I was too afraid to be alone. You gave me a reason to live when everything I loved had been taken from me." Cole felt something crack open inside him, something he had kept locked away for 15 years because he had been afraid to examine it too closely. He covered her hand with his own, feeling the warmth of her skin against his palm, and he knew in that moment that whatever challenges still lay ahead, he would face them. He would face anything for the chance to stand beside this woman who had haunted his dreams and given meaning to his solitary years. "The first challenge is complete," Ayesha said, but she did not remove her hand from his chest. "You have proven that you remember who I was, that you listened when I spoke, that the connection we forged in that sick room was real and true." She finally stepped back, and the absence of her touch left him feeling suddenly cold despite the warmth of the morning sun. "But memory alone is not enough, Cole. The second challenge will test whether you have the wisdom to understand the world I come from, the world I have dedicated my life to protecting and preserving." "What must I do?" he asked. She turned and walked toward her horse, her movements graceful and deliberate. "Today you will come with me to my people's camp. You will meet those I have spent 15 years leading and serving. You will see the life we have built on land that was taken from us and given back in pieces too small to sustain our traditions." And then she mounted her horse and looked down at him with eyes that held both hope and warning. "You will answer a question that will determine whether you truly understand what it means to love someone whose path is not the same as yours." Cole did not hesitate. He whistled for his horse, a buckskin gelding that came trotting from the nearby pasture where he had been grazing. As he mounted, he saw something flicker across Ayesha's face that might have been approval. "Follow me," she said, and together they rode toward the rising sun, toward the mountains where her people had made their home, and toward a challenge that would test the depth of his understanding in ways he could not yet imagine. They rode for 2 hours through country that grew wilder and more rugged with every mile. The flat prairie gave way to rolling foothills, and the foothills rose gradually toward mountains whose peaks still held caps of snow despite the summer heat. Cole had been to the edge of this territory before, conducting business with traders who served as intermediaries between the ranchers and the tribes, but he had never ventured deeper into the land that Ayesha's people called home. The first sign of habitation came when they crested a ridge and looked down into a valley that seemed to shimmer with life. Teepees stood in orderly clusters along a creek that sparkled in the sunlight, and horses grazed in meadows that stretched green and lush toward the tree line. Children ran between the lodges, their laughter carrying on the wind, and women worked at tasks both ancient and practical, while men tended to horses and weapons with the careful attention of people who knew their survival depended on being prepared for anything. "This is my home," Ayesha said, reining her horse to a stop beside him. "This is what I have fought for, what I have sacrificed for, what I would die for without hesitation." She turned to look at him, and he saw the fierce pride burning in her eyes. "When I was a girl lying in your mother's house, I dreamed of rebuilding what the river had taken from me. This valley, these people, the future we are creating here, this is that dream made real." "It is beautiful," Cole said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The valley radiated a peace and vitality that he had rarely encountered, a sense of community and purpose that made his own isolated ranch house feel suddenly lonely by comparison. "Beauty is not enough," Ayesha replied, urging her horse forward down the ridge. "Beauty can be destroyed, stolen, erased from the earth as if it never existed. My people know this better than anyone. We have seen our lands taken, our traditions outlawed, our children forced into schools where they were forbidden to speak their own language." She did not look back at him as she spoke, but her voice carried clearly over the sound of their horses' hooves. "What we have here exists because we have learned to fight for it, to adapt without surrendering who we are, to find strength in the old ways while learning to navigate the new world that has been forced upon us." They descended into the valley, and Cole felt the weight of countless eyes upon him as they passed between the lodges. The people did not approach, but they watched with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion to outright hostility. He understood their wariness. Men who looked like him had taken everything from them, had made promises that turned to ash, had pushed them to the margins of their own homeland. Why should they trust another one now? Ayesha led him to a lodge that stood slightly apart from the others, larger and more elaborately decorated than its neighbors. An old woman sat outside the entrance, her face so lined with age that it resembled the map of a river delta, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had seen empires rise and fall and learned to trust nothing but her own judgment. "Grandmother," Ayesha said, dismounting and approaching the old woman with obvious reverence, "I have brought him as I said I would." The old woman studied Cole for a long moment, her gaze moving over him with the thoroughness of a horse trader examining potential stock. Then she spoke in her own language, a rapid flow of syllables that Cole could not understand, but that clearly carried weight and meaning. Ayesha listened, nodded, and turned back to Cole. "My grandmother says you have honest eyes, but that honest eyes can belong to weak hearts. She says she has known many men who meant well, but lacked the strength to follow through on their good intentions." He could see the challenge in her expression as she translated. "She asks what you would sacrifice for love, if love demanded sacrifice." Cole dismounted slowly, understanding that his answer to this question mattered more than anything he had said or done since Ayesha's return. He approached the old woman and knelt in the dust before her, placing himself lower than her seated position in a gesture of respect he hoped she would recognize. "I would sacrifice my comfort," he said, speaking directly to the grandmother, even though Ayesha would have to translate. "I would sacrifice my pride, my certainty that my way of seeing the world is the only way." He paused, gathering his thoughts, knowing he had to get this right. "I cannot say I would sacrifice my life, because such words are easy to speak and hard to prove. But I can say that 15 years ago, I did not think about sacrifice when I rode into that river. I thought only of the girl who needed saving, and everything else, the danger, the fear, the possibility of death, simply ceased to exist." Ayesha translated his words, and he watched the old woman's face for any sign of her reaction. For a long moment there was nothing, just the steady weight of her ancient gaze upon his face. Then she spoke again, her voice softer this time, and when Ayesha translated, there was something like wonder in her voice. "She says that you speak truth, but that words spoken in the heat of moment are different from the choices made in the cold light of ordinary days. She asks if you understand that loving me means loving my people, accepting that I will never abandon them, that I will always be their leader first and your wife second." "I understand," Cole said, and as he spoke the words, he realized that he truly did. He had spent 15 years building a ranch, accumulating land and cattle and the respect of his neighbors. But Ayesha had spent those same years building something far more precious, a future for people who had been told they had no future, a home for those who had been driven from their homes. "Then rise," Ayesha said, extending her hand to help him to his feet. "The second challenge is not yet complete, but you have passed its first test." The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the western peaks when Ayesha led Cole through the heart of the camp, showing him the life her people had built in this remote valley. She introduced him to warriors who had fought in battles he had only heard rumors of, to women who wove blankets and baskets with patterns that told stories stretching back through countless generations, to children who looked at him with wide eyes and whispered questions to their mothers in a language he could not understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. Who is this stranger, and why has our leader brought him here? At the center of the camp stood a building that surprised Cole with its solidity and purpose. It was constructed of timber and stone, with real glass windows and a chimney that spoke of permanence in a community that had once been forced to move with the seasons. A sign above the door bore words in both English and Ayesha's native tongue, and though he could not read the latter, he recognized the former immediately. "Clearwater School," he read aloud, turning to look at Ayesha with new understanding. "You built this." "With my own hands, in part," she replied, and there was quiet pride in her voice, "and with the hands of everyone in this valley who believed that our children deserved to learn their own history alongside the skills they would need to survive in the world outside." She pushed open the door and led him inside, where rows of wooden desks faced a chalkboard covered with lessons in 2 languages. "For years, our children were taken from us and sent to government schools where they were punished for speaking their language, for practicing their traditions, for being who they were." She ran her fingers along the edge of one of the desks, her expression distant with memory. "I swore that would never happen here. Our children learn English and mathematics and history, but they also learned the songs of our ancestors, the stories that tell us who we are, the skills that have kept our people alive for thousands of years. Cole looked around the small schoolroom, taking in the maps on the walls that showed territories his people had claimed and her people had lost. The books stacked neatly on shelves that contained knowledge from both worlds, the drawings pinned above the chalkboard that depicted scenes of traditional life rendered in the bright colors of childhood imagination. He thought about his own education, the schoolhouse in town where he had learned to read and cipher, and he realized that he had never questioned the things he was taught or wondered what had been left out. "This is remarkable," he said, and he meant it. "You have created something that will outlast all of us." "That is my hope," Ayesha replied. "But hope is fragile, Cole. There are men in the government who would close this school if they knew it existed. There are ranchers who look at this valley and see only land that could be used for cattle, resources that could be extracted and sold." She turned to face him, and he saw the weight of responsibility she carried reflected in her dark eyes. "Every day I fight battles that no one sees, negotiations and compromises and small victories that keep my people safe for one more season. It is exhausting work, and it never ends." He stepped closer to her, moved by the weariness he heard beneath her words. "You should not have to fight alone." "I have never been alone," she said. "My people stand with me as I stand with them. But there is a different kind of loneliness, Cole. The loneliness of leadership, of making decisions that affect everyone and having no one to share the burden with." She looked up at him, and for the first time since her return, he saw vulnerability in her expression. "That is why I came back to you. Not because I need a man to complete me, but because I remember the way you listened during those long nights in your mother's house. The way you heard me without trying to fix me or change me or tell me what I should feel." The space between them seemed to shrink, though neither of them moved. Cole could feel the pull of something ancient and powerful, a connection that had been forged in crisis and tempered by years of separation. He wanted to reach out and touch her, to pull her into his arms and promise that he would never let her face her battles alone again. But he knew that such promises meant nothing without proof, and the second challenge was not yet complete. "Tell me," he said quietly. "Tell me what question I must answer to prove that I understand your world." Ayesha held his gaze for a long moment, and he could see her weighing his sincerity, measuring the depth of his commitment against the enormity of what she was about to ask. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the valley where her people went about their daily lives, carrying within them traditions that had survived conquest and exile, and the relentless pressure of a world that wanted them to disappear. "My people believe that the land does not belong to us," she said softly. "We belong to the land. It is our mother, our provider, our sacred trust to protect for those who will come after us." She turned back to face him, and her eyes held both challenge and hope. "Your people believe that land is property, something to be owned and used and passed down like cattle or coins." She crossed her arms over her chest, the familiar gesture of challenge. "So tell me, Cole Thornwood, if you were to stand beside me as my husband, whose belief would guide your actions? Would you see this valley as I see it, as sacred ground that must be protected at any cost? Or would you see it as your neighbors do, as resources waiting to be claimed?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that stretched far beyond the two of them. Cole understood that his answer would determine not just whether he passed this challenge, but whether there was any real possibility of a future together. Their worlds were different in ways that went deeper than language or custom, touching the very foundations of how they understood their place in creation. He took a deep breath and began to speak. Cole thought about the ranch he had built, the fences he had strung across land that had once known no boundaries, the cattle he had branded with marks of ownership that declared, "This is mine," in a language everyone understood. He thought about his grandfather, who had carved the first Thornwood homestead out of wilderness and fought to hold it against anyone who challenged his claim. He thought about generations of his family who had believed, without question, that the land existed to be tamed and controlled and made productive. Then he thought about the river that had nearly killed Ayesha, the same river that watered his pastures and gave life to his herd. He had never owned that river, no matter what the territorial maps might say. It flowed according to its own ancient rhythms, rising and falling with the seasons, taking what it wanted and giving what it chose. He had learned to work with it, not against it, because fighting a river was a battle no man could win. When I was young, he said slowly, choosing his words with care, my father took me up into the mountains to show me where our water came from. We rode for 3 days, climbing higher than I had ever been, until we reached a glacier that gleamed blue and white against the sky. He paused, remembering the awe he had felt standing in that frozen cathedral. My father told me that glacier had been there since before his grandfather's grandfather was born, and it would still be there long after our grandchildren's grandchildren had turned to dust. He said the water that flowed from it did not belong to us. We were just borrowing it for a little while, and we had a duty to pass it on as clean and pure as we found it. Ayasha listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. Cole pressed on, feeling his way toward a truth he had never fully articulated before. I forgot that lesson for a long time, he admitted. I got caught up in building the ranch, expanding my holdings, proving that I was as successful as my father and his father before him. I started thinking of the land as something I had conquered, something that owed me a return on my investment of sweat and blood. He shook his head, ashamed of the man he had become without even realizing it. But the land does not care about my investments. The droughts came whether I had worked hard or not. The winters killed my cattle regardless of how much I had paid for them. The river flooded and took fences that had cost me months to build. He stepped closer to Ayasha, needing her to understand what he was trying to say. Your question asks me to choose between 2 ways of seeing the world, but I do not think it is that simple. I was raised to believe one thing, and I cannot pretend that belief does not live inside me still. But I have also learned through years of hard experience that the land is not something we can ever truly own. We can only live on it, work with it, try to understand its rhythms and respect its power. He reached out and took her hand, feeling her fingers curl tentatively around his. If standing beside you means learning to see the land as you see it, then I am willing to learn. Not because I want to pass your test, but because I think your way of seeing might be closer to the truth than anything my people have taught me. For a long moment, Ayasha said nothing. Her hand remained in his, warm and strong, but her expression gave nothing away. Cole felt his heart pounding in his chest, knowing that everything depended on whether she believed him, whether his words had been enough to bridge the chasm between their worlds. My grandmother would say, "You speak like a man who is beginning to wake up," Ayasha said finally. She would also say that waking up is not the same as being awake. The journey from understanding a truth to living it can take a lifetime. I know, Cole replied. I am not claiming to have arrived. I am only saying I am willing to walk the path. Something shifted in Ayasha's expression, a softening that made her seem younger and more vulnerable than he had seen her since her return. She squeezed his hand once, then released it and stepped back, putting distance between them that felt like more than just physical space. The second challenge is complete, she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like relief. You have shown that you can listen without defending, that you can question your own beliefs without abandoning who you are. She walked toward the schoolroom door, then paused with her hand on the frame. But the third challenge remains, Cole, and it will be the hardest of all. He followed her out into the late afternoon light, where shadows were beginning to stretch long across the valley. The camp had grown quieter as the day wound toward evening, cooking fires sending threads of smoke into the sky, children being called inside by mothers who knew the mountain nights grew cold quickly. What is the third challenge? Cole asked, falling into step beside her as they walked back toward where their horses were tethered. Ayasha did not answer immediately. She seemed to be wrestling with something, her brow furrowed in thought, her steps slower than they had been before. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost reluctant. The third challenge is not something I can explain, she said. It is something that must be experienced. Tomorrow, at dawn, you will ride with me to a place that is sacred to my people. There you will face a test that will reveal the true nature of your heart." She stopped and turned to face him, her dark eyes filled with an emotion he could not name. "I must warn you, Cole. Men have failed this test before. Strong men, brave men, men who believed they were ready for whatever awaited them." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his weathered cheek. "I do not want you to fail, but I cannot help you pass. This test you must face alone." Cole covered her hand with his own, drawing strength from her touch. "Whatever it is," he said, "I will face it. I have waited 15 years for you, Ayasha. I will not turn back now." She smiled then, but it was a sad smile, weighted with knowledge she could not share. "Rest tonight," she said, pulling her hand away. "You will need your strength for what is to come." The camp provided Cole with a lodge for the night, a small teepee near the edge of the settlement where he could rest undisturbed. He lay on the buffalo robes that served as bedding and stared up at the smoke hole where stars wheeled slowly past, cold and distant and utterly indifferent to the turmoil in his heart. Sleep came in fitful snatches, interrupted by dreams he could not quite remember, but that left him feeling unsettled and strangely exposed. Before the first gray light of dawn had touched the eastern peaks, Ayasha appeared at the entrance to his lodge. She was dressed differently than before, wearing a ceremonial dress of white doeskin decorated with beadwork that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Her hair was braided with feathers and shells, and her face bore marks of red and white paint that transformed her familiar features into something ancient and otherworldly. "It is time," she said simply, and Cole rose without question, following her out into the cold morning air. They rode in silence as the sky slowly brightened, climbing higher into the mountains, along trails so faint that Cole would never have found them on his own. The horses picked their way carefully over rocky ground, breathing hard in the thin air, their hooves sending small stones clattering down into valleys that grew ever more distant below. Ayasha led the way with the confidence of someone who had traveled this path many times before, never hesitating, never looking back to see if Cole was following. After what felt like hours, they emerged onto a plateau that seemed to hang suspended between earth and sky. The view was staggering, range after range of mountains stretching away to the horizon, their peaks catching the first golden rays of the rising sun. At the center of the plateau stood a circle of standing stones, weathered by countless centuries of wind and rain, their surfaces carved with symbols that Cole could not read, but that seemed to pulse with meaning he could almost grasp. "This is the place of visions," Ayasha said, dismounting and leading her horse to a small spring that bubbled from the rocks nearby. "For generations beyond counting, my people have come here to seek guidance from the spirits." She turned to face him, and her expression was grave. "Today you will enter the circle and remain there until the spirits choose to speak to you. I cannot tell you what you will see or hear. I cannot prepare you for what awaits." She stepped closer and placed her hand over his heart. "All I can tell you is that the spirits see everything, Cole. Every truth you have hidden from yourself, every fear you have refused to face, every dream you have been too afraid to pursue. They will show you who you really are, and you must have the courage to look without flinching." Cole felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What if I do not like what I see?" "Then you will have learned something important about yourself," Ayasha replied, "and you will have to decide whether to remain the man you have been or become the man you were meant to be." She stepped back and gestured toward the circle of stones. "Go now. The spirits do not like to be kept waiting." He walked toward the circle on legs that felt strangely unsteady, passing between two of the standing stones and entering a space that seemed somehow separate from the world outside. The air was different here, thicker, and charged with an energy that made his skin prickle and his heart race. He sat down in the center of the circle, crossing his legs beneath him as he had seen the men in Ayasha's camp do, and waited. At first, nothing happened. The sun continued its slow climb across the sky, and the wind whispered through the stones with a sound like distant voices. Cole tried to empty his mind, to open himself to whatever the spirits might want to show him. But his thoughts kept racing in circles, chasing fears and hopes and memories that refused to stay still. Then, without warning, the world changed. The plateau vanished, and Cole found himself standing in a place that was both familiar and utterly strange. It was the Thornwood Ranch, but not as he had ever seen it. The fences were gone, the cattle were gone. The carefully maintained buildings had crumbled into ruins that were being slowly reclaimed by the prairie grass. Where his house had stood, there was only a foundation of broken stones, half buried in soil that bore no trace of the life that had once been lived there. He walked through the ruins of his legacy, his boots making no sound on ground that felt insubstantial beneath his feet. Everything he had worked for, everything his father and grandfather had built, had been erased as if it had never existed. The land had simply continued on without them, healing itself from the wounds they had inflicted, returning to the wildness that had existed before any Thornwood had ever set foot on this soil. "Is this what you fear?" a voice asked, and Cole spun around to find himself face to face with a figure that he did not recognize. It was a man, or something that wore the shape of a man, with features that seemed to shift and change like smoke in the wind. "That your work will be forgotten, that the land will outlast your memory." "Yes," Cole admitted, because there was no point in lying to whatever this being was. "I am afraid that nothing I do will matter in the end." The figure nodded, as if this was the expected answer. "Then let me show you what you should truly fear," it said, and the world changed again. This time, Cole found himself standing on the banks of a river, watching a wagon being swept downstream by the current. He knew this scene, had lived it 15 years ago, but something was different. This time, he was not on horseback. This time, he was standing on the shore, frozen in place, unable to move as a young girl screamed for help that was not coming. He tried to run toward the water, tried to force his legs to carry him into the current, but his body would not obey. He could only watch, helpless and horrified, as the wagon disappeared beneath the churning surface, and the girl's screams were silenced forever. "This," the spirit said, appearing beside him, "is the fear that has shaped your entire life. Not the fear of being forgotten, but the fear of failing to act when action is needed." Cole fell to his knees on the riverbank, the weight of the vision crushing down on him like a physical force. The spirit's words echoed through his mind, stripping away the layers of self-deception he had built up over a lifetime. He had always told himself that he rode into the river that night because he was brave, because he was the kind of man who acted when others hesitated. But the truth was more complicated and far less flattering. He had been running from that fear his entire life. Every fence he built, every acre he acquired, every careful plan he made for the future was an attempt to create a world where he would never again face a moment of such terrible uncertainty. He had buried himself in work and routine, convincing himself that he was building something meaningful when really he was just hiding from the possibility of failure. "You begin to understand," the spirit said, and its voice carried neither approval nor condemnation, only observation. "But understanding is not enough. Knowledge without action is merely another form of cowardice." The riverbank dissolved, and Cole found himself standing in the corral of his ranch, facing Ayesha as she had appeared that first day, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes filled with challenge. But this time she was not alone. Behind her stood the people of her village, the children from the school, the grandmother whose ancient eyes saw everything. They were all watching him, waiting for something he did not know how to give. "She came back for you," the spirit said, appearing at his shoulder. "She spent 15 years becoming someone worthy of the sacrifice you made. But you spent those same years hiding from the man you could have become. You built walls instead of bridges. You accumulated possessions instead of connections. You convinced yourself that safety was the same as living." Cole wanted to argue, to defend the choices he had made, but the words died in his throat. The spirit was right. He had been so afraid of failing again, of riding into another river and not being strong enough to save whoever needed saving, that he had stopped riding into rivers altogether. He had made himself small and careful and safe, and in doing so, he had betrayed the very courage that had once defined him. "What must I do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The spirit moved to stand before him, and for a moment its shifting features seemed to settle into something almost familiar. "You must choose," it said. You can return to your ranch and continue the life you have been living. The fences will keep standing, the cattle will keep grazing, the years will pass, and eventually you will die, having risked nothing and gained nothing beyond what you already possess." The figure paused, and something that might have been compassion flickered in its inhuman eyes. "Or you can ride into the river again, not the river of water, but the river of life. You can tear down your fences and open yourself to the terrifying possibility of failure, of loss, of loving someone so deeply that her pain becomes your pain and her battles become your battles." The vision shifted once more, and Cole found himself standing at a crossroads. To his left stretched a path that led back to the ranch, comfortable and familiar, bounded by fences that marked the limits of his world. To his right stretched a path that wound up into the mountains, toward the valley where Ayesha's people had built their school and their homes and their fragile hope for the future. "Choose," the spirit commanded, and its voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Choose now, and choose forever." Cole looked at the two paths, and for a long moment he felt the pull of the familiar, the seductive safety of the life he had already built. He could go back. He could tell Ayesha that he had failed the test, that he was not the man she remembered, that she should find someone else to stand beside her. It would hurt, but the hurt would fade eventually, and he would still have his ranch and his routine and his careful, bounded existence. But then he thought about the school Ayesha had built, the children learning to walk in two worlds without losing themselves in either. He thought about the grandmother whose eyes held the wisdom of generations, and the warriors who had fought and sacrificed so their people could have a future. He thought about Ayesha herself, who had spent 15 years becoming someone extraordinary, while he had spent those same years becoming someone ordinary. He thought about the river and the moment when he had stopped thinking about danger and simply acted. That moment had been the truest moment of his life, the moment when he had been most fully himself. Everything since then had been a slow retreat from that truth, a gradual surrender to fear disguised as prudence. "I choose the mountains," he said, and his voice was stronger than he expected. "I choose the river. I choose to ride into whatever is coming and trust that the courage I found once still lives somewhere inside me." The spirit smiled, and for just an instant, Cole could have sworn he saw his father's face looking back at him. Then the vision shattered like ice breaking on a spring river, and he was lying on his back in the circle of standing stones, staring up at a sky that had turned the deep purple of approaching twilight. Ayesha was kneeling beside him, her face tight with worry, her hand cool against his forehead. "Cole," she said, and her voice carried relief that told him she had feared the worst. "You have been in the circle since dawn. I was beginning to think you would not return." He sat up slowly, his body aching as if he had run a great distance, his mind still reeling from everything the spirits had shown him. He looked at Ayesha, at the woman who had believed in him enough to cross 15 years and countless miles, and he knew exactly what he needed to say. "I saw who I have been," he said quietly, "and I saw who I could become." He reached out and took her hands in his, feeling her fingers tremble slightly in his grasp. "I choose to become something better, Ayesha. I choose to stand beside you, not because I am worthy, but because I want to be worthy. I want to spend whatever years I have left earning the faith you placed in me when you decided to come back." Ayesha's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. She had seen men emerge from the circle of stones before, had watched warriors and chiefs face whatever truths the spirits chose to reveal. Some had come out broken, their certainty shattered beyond repair. Others had come out unchanged, having seen nothing because they had nothing inside them worth seeing. But Cole's face held something different, a rawness that spoke of wounds laid open and examined, of comfortable lies stripped away to reveal harder truths beneath. "The spirits showed you something painful," she said. It was not a question. "They showed me myself," Cole replied, and there was no self-pity in his voice, only the quiet acceptance of a man who had finally stopped running from his own reflection. "They showed me that the man who rode into the river 15 years ago was braver than the man I became afterward. They showed me that I have spent my whole life building walls to protect myself from the possibility of failing again. He looked down at their joined hands, his weathered fingers intertwined with her slender ones. But walls that keep out pain also keep out everything else. I have been safe for 15 years, Ayesha, and I have been utterly alone. She lifted one hand to his face, tracing the lines that time and sun and solitary labor had carved into his features. You do not have to be alone anymore, she said softly. But you need to understand what standing beside me truly means. My path is not easy, Cole. There will be battles that seem impossible to win. There will be losses that break our hearts. There will be days when the weight of responsibility feels like it will crush us both. I know, he said. The spirits showed me that too. They showed me your valley in ruins, your school burned, your people scattered to the winds. He saw her flinch at the image, but he pressed on, needing her to understand. But they also showed me something else. They showed me that the only way to prevent that future is to fight for a different one. Not hiding behind fences, pretending the world outside does not exist, but standing in the open and facing whatever comes. Ayesha was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt or deception. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because when she spoke again, her voice carried a warmth that had been absent since of her return. The third challenge is complete, she said. You have faced the spirits and emerged with your heart open instead of closed. You have proven that the courage I saw in you 15 years ago was not an accident of youth, but a true reflection of who you are. She stood, pulling him to his feet with surprising strength. There is one thing left to do before we return to my people. She led him to the edge of the plateau, where the mountains fell away in a dizzying drop toward the valleys far below. The setting sun painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, and the wind that rose from the depths carried the scent of pine and snow and wildness. It was one of the most beautiful views Cole had ever seen, and he understood instinctively that this place held special significance. My parents brought me here when I was a child, Ayesha said, her voice soft with memory. They told me that this was where they had pledged themselves to each other, before the eyes of the spirits and the mountains and the setting sun. She turned to face him, and he saw that the tears she had held back earlier were now flowing freely down her painted cheeks. I have dreamed of bringing someone here for 15 years, Cole. I have dreamed of speaking the words my mother spoke to my father, binding myself to another soul in a way that cannot be broken by distance or time or even death. Cole felt his heart hammering against his ribs, understanding what she was asking without her needing to say it directly. This was not just the completion of a challenge. This was the beginning of something far greater, a commitment that would reshape both their lives in ways neither could fully predict. I am not worthy of this place, he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. I am not worthy of you. Worthiness is not something we possess, Ayesha replied. It is something we earn, day by day, choice by choice, sacrifice by sacrifice. She took both his hands in hers and held them between their hearts. The question is not whether you are worthy now. The question is whether you are willing to spend the rest of your life becoming worthy. The wind swirled around them, carrying whispers that might have been the voices of spirits or ancestors, or simply the eternal song of the mountains themselves. Cole looked at the woman standing before him, at the strength and vulnerability and fierce hope burning in her dark eyes, and he knew that this was the moment everything had been building toward. Every choice he had made, every year he had waited, every dream he had harbored in secret, had led him to this plateau at the edge of the world. I am willing, he said, and the words felt like both a promise and a prayer. I will spend every day I have left, earning the faith you have placed in me. I will stand beside you in your battles and carry you when you fall. I will learn the ways of your people and teach you the ways of mine. I will tear down my fences and build bridges instead. He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss against her fingers. I will love you, Ayesha Clearwater, not because you saved my heart from loneliness, but because your heart is the bravest thing I have ever known. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body despite the cold mountain wind. Then speak the words with me, she whispered, the words my parents spoke to each other on this very spot. She began to speak in her own language, and though Cole could not understand the individual words, he somehow grasped their meaning. They were words of binding and belonging, of two rivers joining to become one, of two flames merging into a single fire that would burn brighter than either could alone. When she paused, he repeated the sounds as best he could, feeling their power vibrate through his chest and into the mountain beneath his feet. The sun touched the western peaks and began to sink below them, painting the world in shades of fire and blood and gold. And on the plateau where her parents had once pledged their lives to each other, Ayesha Clearwater and Cole Thornwood became something neither had been before, two halves of a whole that had been searching for completion across 15 years and countless miles. They descended from the mountain as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their horses picking their way carefully down trails that had become treacherous with shadow. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was different now, filled not with uncertainty, but with the comfortable peace of two people who no longer needed words to understand each other. Ayesha rode ahead, her white ceremonial dress glowing faintly in the starlight, and Cole followed, his heart fuller than it had been in 15 years of solitary nights on the prairie. The camp was waiting for them when they emerged from the foothills, torches blazing in a great circle around the central gathering space where the entire village had assembled. Cole felt a moment of apprehension at the sight of so many faces turned toward them, but Ayesha reached back and took his hand, her grip warm and reassuring. "They know," she said quietly. "Word travels fast among my people, especially word of sacred ceremonies performed at the place of visions." She squeezed his fingers. "They have come to welcome you, Cole, not as a stranger, but as one of us." The grandmother was waiting at the edge of the circle, her ancient face transformed by a smile that made her look decades younger. She spoke rapidly in her own language, and Ayesha translated, her voice thick with emotion. She says that she dreamed of this night many years ago. She saw a man from beyond the mountains who would ride into the water to save her granddaughter, and who would return 15 years later to claim what the river had promised him. She says the spirits have been waiting for you almost as long as I have. Cole dismounted and approached the old woman, kneeling before her as he had done that first day. "I am honored to be welcomed among your people," he said. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that honor." The grandmother reached out and placed her weathered hand on his head, speaking words that needed no translation. They were words of blessing and acceptance, of welcome into a family that had existed long before any Thornwood had ever set foot on this land. When she finished, she helped him rise with surprising strength and gestured toward the gathering that awaited them. What followed was unlike anything Cole had experienced in his careful, bounded life. There was feasting and dancing, songs that seemed to rise from the very earth itself, stories told by elders whose memories stretched back through generations of joy and sorrow. Children who had watched him with suspicion now pulled at his hands, demanding that he join their games. Warriors who had eyed him with hostility now clasped his shoulder and called him brother. The women of the village presented Ayesha with gifts for her new household, blankets and baskets and tools that had been prepared in secret, just in case the man from beyond the mountains proved worthy of their leader. Through it all, Ayesha remained at his side, her hand finding his whenever the crowd threatened to separate them, her smile brighter than any torch. "This is what you have chosen," she whispered, as the celebration continued around them. "This chaos and noise and overwhelming love. Are you certain you're ready for it?" Cole looked around at the faces illuminated by firelight, at the children falling asleep in their mother's arms, at the elders nodding their approval, at the warriors whose respect he had somehow earned simply by refusing to give up. He thought about his silent ranch house, the empty rooms where no laughter had echoed for 15 years, the fences that had marked the boundaries of his shrinking world. "I have never been more certain of anything," he said. The celebration continued until the stars began to fade and the eastern sky turned pale with approaching dawn. By the time the last songs had been sung and the last stories told, Cole was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with the overwhelming experience of being truly seen and accepted for the first time in his adult life. Ayesha led him to a lodge that had been prepared for them, larger than the one he had slept in the night before, and decorated with symbols that she explained represented the joining of two families, two peoples, two worlds. They stood together at the entrance, watching the sun rise over the mountains that had witnessed their pledge, and Cole felt the last of his walls crumble into dust. "There will be hard days ahead," Ayasha said quietly. "Your neighbors will not understand. Some of my people will question whether I made the right choice. There will be battles we cannot win and losses we cannot prevent." "I know," Cole replied, wrapping his arms around her from behind and pulling her close against his chest. "But we will face them together. That is what I promised you on the mountain, and it is a promise I intend to keep." She turned in his arms to face him, her dark eyes soft with an emotion that needed no name. "You have already proven yourself worthy, Cole Thornwood. Everything from this point forward is simply living the life we have chosen." He kissed her then, for the first time, there in the doorway of their lodge with the sun rising over the mountains and a new world spreading out before them. It was not the desperate kiss of young lovers, but something deeper and more lasting, a seal on promises made and challenges overcome. A beginning that had taken 15 years to arrive, but was worth every moment of waiting. Behind them, the village was stirring to life, children's voices rising in the morning air, cooking fires sending their fragrant smoke toward the brightening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied and another answered, and the eternal wind whispered through the grass as it had for countless generations before them, and would continue to do for countless generations to come. Cole Thornwood had ridden into a river 15 years ago and saved a stranger's life. Now that stranger had returned to save his, pulling him from the current of fear and isolation that had been slowly drowning him. They had challenged each other and proven their worth, and now they stood together on the threshold of a future neither could have imagined alone. The cowboy who had saved her had faced her challenge and emerged transformed, and the woman who had returned to test him had found something far more precious than proof of worthiness. She had found her way home,